Good evening, everyone. It is Thursday, March 7th at 7 p.m., and I am super excited to welcome all of you to this evening's Landmark Learns Parent Education through Landmark School and Landmark School Outreach. This evening, we have Melissa Orkin and myself, Adam Hickey from Landmark School Outreach, really having a nice conversation with you all around my child is dyslexia and they're at school. And what do I need to know? What's going on in these schools? What supports are available? And I'm really excited to have you here. And I'm really excited to have Melissa here. And I'm going to begin this evening by having Melissa introduce herself. And then I am going to introduce myself as well. But a quick primer on what Landmark Learns is in the event that this is the first one you're attending. We're happy to have you here tonight. It's a series of educational workshops and presentations and resources for parents and guardians and champions of struggling learners hosted by Landmark School. We encourage all of you to join us regardless of whether you have an affiliation with Landmark. All Landmark Learns offerings are delivered in a webinar format, and you can find our recorded ones at the website that you see below. So super excited again to have you here. Melissa, thank you for joining me this evening. And we have a lot to cover and not a lot of time. An hour goes by super fast. So I'm going to start by letting you introduce yourself to all of our webinar participants.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Adam. It is a little surreal to just be looking at you and the audience that's out there, but we can't see or hear them. So I am a developmental psychologist. I'm the co-director of a group called Crafting Minds with my colleague, Sarah Gannon. And I have a background as a reading teacher and a researcher. And I did a number of years of work with Marianne Wolf at the Tufts Center for Reading and Language Research, where we did, a lot of different examinations of best practices for students who were both struggling to read and with dyslexia, particularly students who were struggling with fluency. That was sort of the focus of the work. And through Crafting Minds, now I get to collaborate with school districts around the New England area and, even nationally and think about, the practices that are in place and how schools can continue to expand and develop how they're supporting all readers, including students with dyslexia. And you and I have had the opportunity to collaborate with some schools that we've worked with in varying capacities. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the nature of your work?
Yeah, I would love to. And I think I'll pick up with that collaboration. So part of the work that I do now at Landmark Outreach is to act as a consultant / lead faculty member to support schools, whether public or private, in their abilities to best meet the needs with students with specific learning disabilities, dyslexia, struggling readers. And we've run across each other in that I think we complement our work nicely, where I'll work with a district for a couple of years, and then they'll bring you in to evaluate the efficacy of the work that they're doing in that district. And so I really like this kind of partnership that we loosely have out in the field.
Yeah, it's nice to have colleagues and to see what they're doing and then to be able to validate and reinforce and in some cases expand upon sort of the nature of what they're doing, and then they influence you in your work as well. So all of these collaborations, especially in the Boston area, are so great.
The only other thing I'd add to my bio is that I'm also coordinator of all things research at Landmark School. And it's a super fun role to have. But I think the most important part of that role is my ability to bring the most current research to the practitioners doing the work with students in classrooms. And that is powerful and really amazing that we're able to bridge that chasm in some ways between what the researchers are doing and the knowledge that practitioners need. So that's enough about me. We'll move forward. Thank you.
Okay, great. Do you
And
want to
then this slide is just really to talk about both Landmark School and Landmark Outreach and the work that we're doing to support struggling learners in the field of literacy.
Great.
Let's get into your slides.
Okay, great. So I've put together like a little slideshow because I think it's helpful as we're talking to have like visuals, obviously, to reinforce some of the key ideas. But I am going to also be doing some switching between the slides and some other resources that are online. So ignore my messy desktop and we'll poke around for some different resources, and I can always pop those in the chat, or the great team at Landmark can send it to all the participants after the session as well. All right, so we have a lot to talk about and we want to do it in a really efficient way. So we're going to define dyslexia. We're going to talk about some facts about dyslexia. We're going to talk about using the term dyslexia in the schools and the changes around that in the last couple of years. Assessing dyslexia, and then we'll get into some of the subtypes around dyslexia, that dyslexia is not like a unitary concept. It's actually, really can be broken down into sort of subgroups, and those subgroups are helpful in planning and targeting instruction. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll get a little bit into some of just the practices that are happening now in the school based on recent legislation, particularly screening and the use of structured literacy and the characteristics for tier 1 and tier 2 instruction. And then I think, you'll talk about supporting the executive function needs of students with dyslexia and the writing needs of students with dyslexia. So let's start with the basics. So what is dyslexia? I think that this is a really helpful place to start with just a common understanding. There are so many different myths about dyslexia, but this is the working definition in the field, that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. So essentially what that first sentence means is that it is biological in nature. It has to do with the way that neurons organize themselves in the brain. It has nothing to do with, what a parent ate when they were pregnant or whether they read enough to their child in the early years. It really has to do with the organization of neurons. It is not a medical disorder. It is a learning disability. So for a while, there was sort of this notion in certain circles that only a pediatrician or a neuropsychologist could identify dyslexia, but it's a learning disability. So it's identified by educators with training. And it's largely characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition. So in a nutshell, dyslexia is difficulties with word recognition, whether that's being accurate when you're reading or being fluent and automatic, or both. Other areas that are often affected in an individual with dyslexia are their spelling skills and their decoding abilities. The difficulties usually result from the phonological component of language. And what the definition is referring to is this part of the brain that's sort of the juncture between where we connect the sounds that we hear in language and the symbols or the letter patterns that represent those sounds. So there's this part of the brain that's largely responsible for that connection. That's called the visual word form area. And in individuals with dyslexia, that area tends to be underactivated. So we know there's something around sort of the activation patterns. Dyslexia is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So these are sort of the two pathways to identification. The unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities means that there's usually a discrepancy or a significant difference between a student's intellectual abilities or their intellectual potential based on intelligence testing and their academic skills, specifically in reading. Usually that significant split is about 20 points or more. So imagine if a student scores, like 120 on a measure of intelligence testing, and they only score 100 on a measure of reading, they could be considered a candidate for dyslexia with the discrepancy diagnosis. Or the other pathway is that the student has received effective classroom instruction. They've received, high quality instruction in the classroom and reading. They've received reading support through intervention, and the student is not making meaningful growth despite that ongoing instruction. And secondary consequences may include problems with reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that impedes the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So when reading is really hard for you, it is usually something that you'll avoid. Or if you are engaging in reading, it's often that you're only able to really access texts that are kind of limited in terms of their content and the complexity of the text. And so that reduces the amount of learning that you can do by using reading as a learning tool. So that's the idea, that it can restrict vocabulary learning and background knowledge. So that is dyslexia in a nutshell. Some interesting facts about dyslexia. Approximately 24% of disabilities that are reported by Massachusetts school districts are students with specific learning disabilities. And of those, dyslexia is considered the most common. Dyslexia in the general population affects about 5 to 17% of individuals. As I mentioned, it's largely characterized by difficulty learning to read despite adequate intelligence and instruction. And dyslexia is highly hereditary. So if you have a first degree relative, like a parent or a sibling that either had trouble learning to read or had a formal diagnosis, then you have a 50% chance of being identified yourself. And if you have two first-degree relatives, like a sibling or and a parent, then that rate of prevalence goes up to about 80%. So it tends to run in families. And that is a risk factor that we should share with, educators. Or if you are an educator and a family comes to you and says, I'm concerned because I have an older child who has dyslexia and I want you to test my younger child, then it is certainly something to take into consideration. All right, so Adam, this is a biggie. Can schools use the term dyslexia during assessment instructional planning? So when you started in the field, what was like your understanding of this? Could
Yeah,
schools use it?
so I started in the field really at Landmark. So certainly the use of that term was so normed and
Yeah,
as part of our daily, rhetoric.
yeah,
And then when I started getting into districts, there was this unexpected from me fear of unexpectedly was witnessing fear of using
yeah,
that term in that language,
yeah.
and the swiftness of the turnaround and the embracing in many districts now of using this term is really refreshing. Are you seeing the same
Yeah,
thing?
definitely. And I agree. Like when I started in public schools, and when I was in public schools, like you would not say the word dyslexia aloud. Like it was crazy. And nobody really knew why, But certainly now, as you said, there is a clear message coming from the Department of Education. And that also comes from federal guidance that we endorse the use of the term dyslexia during evaluation, eligibility determinations, and in IEP documents when students meet the criteria. And so you might be saying, well, how do I know if students meet the criteria? Well, really, that's why I spent the time going over the definition, because the definition is the criteria that the student should display difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition that is related to a specific learning disability, and that is either unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities, and or the provision of effective classroom instruction. So those kind of are the criteria. There isn't like a set metric.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, and this has been a real shift for many schools. There is still a reticence, I think, among practitioners to use the term, not necessarily because they're trying to, make things difficult, but because they just feel uncertain in their ability to appropriately identify who meets the characteristics and who doesn't. And sometimes it's a gray area. It's not clear cut.
I think that's such a good point to bring up as we start tonight, because I know that many of the participants here on this webinar are really going to be looking for, okay, so what do I do? This might be brand new to me. And I think the message that both you and I want to encourage is use the word and,
Yeah.
and encourage the practitioners, the teachers, the educators to use the word or defend why they don't want to and enter into that dialogue.
Definitely. And I think, one of the reasons that I wanted to use, using the word for teams in schools really requires not only permission, which we have explicitly here, but also training and coaching, at the school level. Um, one of the reasons that I wanted to use the Massachusetts Dyslexia Guidelines as a resource is because it's accessible to everyone. All you need to do is Google like Mass Dyslexia Guidelines. It's a PDF document. It's been put out by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts, which is sort of the state Department of Education. And it's really a very helpful, objective resource that is a great discussion tool for schools and families as they embark on this process or as they continue the process of trying to formulate sort of the best learning experience for their students. So here I am on page 56, but page 1 looks like this. And you'll see in the guidelines, there are these different sections on the definition of dyslexia, what we just went over, screening. There's a lot of talk about the different systems that are in schools, including instruction and progress monitoring and assessment. There is a discussion about special education services if your child is identified with dyslexia, considerations for multilingual students or bidialectical learners. So there's lots of good information that that is clear and manageable for educators and families who maybe don't have a background in reading instruction to digest. Okay, so let us continue. All right, so this question was going to be like, let's imagine that your child is being assessed for dyslexia. Maybe you're joining us because you're in the process of an evaluation, or you've referred or you've requested an evaluation for dyslexia. And you're just wondering, like, what is this process? Like, how does this work? Is there one test that tells you what dyslexia is or what it isn't? And so there is not one test. And as I said, there isn't like one score. It really is this like constellation sort of difficulties in measures of reading accuracy or fluency. And so when we're assessing students, we're collecting information in a variety of different areas. Those are going to include measures of intelligence, like cognitive ability, measures of reading accuracy, measures of reading fluency, and oral language measures. And for each of these measures, you're going to get some information about the student's very foundational skills in this category. So for example, in the domain of reading accuracy, a very foundational skill would be something like phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness refers to our ability to break apart sounds in words and manipulate sounds. And that's a really important underlying skill for being able to read words and spell words accurately. In the domain of reading fluency, a RAN task is a foundational measure. And in the domain of language skills, a vocabulary measure, like both students' ability to like indicate that they understand what a word means, or, if they're given a word meaning, like to, launch quickly out of a plane, they would be able to point to a word or indicate that that word means eject, or something. That definition means eject. So those are some foundational measures. And then we have some single word reading measures. So just individual words, how accurate is a student reading individual words, like sight words and nonsense words? How fluent are they at reading those words? And then how do they organize that language in speech or in understanding? And then at the top level, we have measures of passage, reading, fluency, and comprehension. So usually the assessment piece is pretty comprehensive. It takes several hours to complete. It's not just like a quick, you know, a screen. Um, Teachers are using validated, reliable assessment tools. They're following particular protocols. It's usually, administered by either a special educator or a school psychologist who has training in the administration. And the reason that we're collecting all of this information is so that we can really pinpoint where the difficulties lie. Now, when you have this information, it can be kind of daunting to interpret it. It's daunting for educators, and educators spend hours each day doing this work. So it's very daunting for families and parents who may not have a background in education. So one thing we developed at our group Crafting Minds is this graphic organizer, which I think is really helpful for families to be able to interpret patterns of strength and weakness. And this is something that some families have completed independently. Some families have brought it into schools and said, I have this graphic organizer. Can you help me fill this out, so that I know which tests go in which spot? But we have this on our website, and it's a drop-down menu. So there are different brands of tests. So the drop-down menu allows you to choose the brand or the type of test that your school used to measure, for example, oral reading comprehension. And then you can put the student's score in the descriptor. And the descriptor usually means like average range, below average range, above average range. And what I like about this, Adam, and what both parents and teachers have found helpful is that it quickly allows you to see, are there patterns of difficulties in accurate or fluent word reading? So the accurate word reading column is right here in orange, and the fluent word reading column is right here in green. It's called retrieval here, but that is synonymous with fluency. Or whether difficulties in reading are due to like organizing language, like being able to keep track of the main idea and the details and understand how ideas go together. So this website is this graphic organizer is available at our website, which is craftingmindsgroup.com. And while you're talking, I can put the link in the chat if anyone's interested.
Melissa, I really think this graphic is incredible. Not only because I think it starts to demystify and define for a parent who's new to this, where should we be looking? What are the different variables that are leading to this diagnosis of dyslexia?
Yeah.
But I think I'm truly an educator at my heart, even though I'm in the world of research right now, because what I want to use this graphic for is to start directing instruction.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't want to remediate an area where a child has a strength. We want to target the remediation in the areas of need, and then use that area of strength to help the student compensate in a really purposeful way. And what an amazing tool to really start that process for somebody who might be new to this.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying. Yeah, I think that I think you're reminding me too that it does allow you also to see students' strengths, and to identify or pinpoint areas of need. And the thinking is that, it would become pretty apparent if a student needs a goal or an objective, a learning objective, which is how we structure, individualized education plans, is kind of underneath these overarching goals. And then in order to achieve these goals, they're kind of like the steps, which are the objectives, basically. And it'll make it apparent whether or not, a student needs an objective in something like phonemic awareness, or they need an objective in some fluency areas. So it's really helpful. And sometimes it's helpful too to use this like to keep it, because then from year to year or evaluation to evaluation, you're able to kind of look at the growth too.
Yeah,
Sometimes that is hard to kind of organize.
sure.
All right. So this kind of leads us into this next question, which is around instruction. So should all students with dyslexia receive the same type of instruction? And I think this is a real, like, point of confusion or, pondering for families, because you might have a friend who has a child with dyslexia, or, know another family in the district, and their child got a very specific type of curriculum and it worked really well for their child. And maybe, you feel very strongly that your child should get that curriculum, or that you're disappointed that it's not having the same effect for your child. And so, and I don't know if you've encountered this as well. Do you receive this question a lot yeah.
We're receiving it constantly, but you know what? I really appreciate the question though, Melissa, because we're using that to help districts target best practices in a way that they weren't doing years ago.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I just think it's great.
Yeah. So, when we think about dyslexia, as I said, kind of, a few minutes ago at 7 o'clock, dyslexia is not a unitary construct. It's not one thing. It's thought of as a spectrum condition. And I mean that in that both dyslexia can vary in its severity. So you can have a mild form of dyslexia, you can have a severe form of dyslexia. But you can also have, a type of dyslexia that is impacting one particular aspect of your reading. So reading, and we don't have the time to go into it tonight, but if we did, I would show you this like amazing visual of a reading brain from like the neuroscientist Stanislav Dehaene, and how involved our brain is when we are reading proficiently, that it's not like one little area of neurons that's activated, that it's really involves broad activation across various lobes of the brain. And so when there is a student who has dyslexia and is challenged in reading, it's because, they might be having an impairment in one particular area, or an underactivation in one particular part of their circuit. And so when we think about how to predict, or how to be able to determine what area needs to be remediated and what type of instruction, these subtypes are sort of a launching point for that conversation. So this subtype work was done initially by Marianne Wolf, so my mentor at Tufts back in 1999, and has now been expanded globally, and it's ongoing to try to predict and understand subtypes of dyslexia to better target instruction. And so to give you an overview, and this information is in the dyslexia guidelines, and there's a whole section on it. So if you're interested in this, you can certainly use that as a resource. But the first subtype is probably what we usually think of when we think of an individual with dyslexia, and that's called the phonological subtype. And it's called the phonological subtype because it's characterized by difficulties with matching up sounds and letters. So sounds being phonology and letter patterns being orthography. And when we take sounds and letters and we put them together, we get phonics, basically, the code of phonics for English. So a phonological deficit is usually, or a phonological subtype is usually characterized by below average scores in phonemic awareness skills, decoding skills, sight word accuracy, and passage reading accuracy. So if I could go back for one moment to this graphic, basically we would be looking at this graphic organizer, and this is the column that would largely be affected if a student had fell into that phonological subtype. And phonological subtypes benefit from instruction in phonics, explicit systematic instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics. And we have so many amazing programs that do that kind of work. You know, the field is really like blossoming with them, but you can think of, Orton Gillingham and Wilson and Project Read and Lips. And do you have some that you recommend to people, Adam?
Oh, for sure. And the ones that you're naming, OG, anything that's OG
Yeah,
methodology.
Spire is
Yeah.
great. Yeah. They're systematic, they're following a sequence, they're explicit, they're giving students practice in the lesson, both, reading and spelling. The whole lesson is really like tightly controlled. And so everything that's being expected of the student is taught. And it really, gives the individual an opportunity to practice learning the phonics code. And then you often need to supplement that instruction with some phonemic awareness activities that's not often built in. So you'll want to supplement that. The naming speed subtype is probably the lesser known subtype. And this was the one that Marianne was really interested in sort of uncovering and featuring, because the naming speed subtype is really kind of characterized by students who are accurate, but the retrieval is the challenge. And so automaticity tends to be a bottleneck. So you often see this most on measures of what we think of as efficiency or fluency. So these individuals often have a below average score on rapid automatic naming, decoding efficiency, sight word efficiency, or passage reading fluency. So going back to this graphic, it would be this green area here that would be affected. So you could have a student who's accurate and performs well on untimed measures of reading, but is struggling with automaticity. And so there are programs that are designed for those students. So Marianne at Tufts designed a program called RAVE-O, and it's the word rave, comma O, and it's an acronym. There are some fluency programs like Read Naturally and Great Leaps. I would kind of caution you with those. Those are really only for students who are struggling with fluency at the passage level. But there's also Language exclamation point live, and that's a wonderful program that is for students with kind of those fluency issues at the upper grade levels. So language RAVO is really for, like, I would say first to fourth grade, and Language Live is for like fifth through high school. And then there are students who have a double deficit. So double deficit is when students have both their scores fall into both the phonological and the naming speed subtype. And they tend to be on the more severe side of the dyslexia spectrum. And we have been really interested in this subgroup, and they have not gotten the attention that they need in the research. At our center at Tufts, we did some work trying to figure out, what is the best dosage for these students, because they need the instruction in both the phonics and the phonemic awareness, but they also need instruction in fluency. And so we have found anecdotally, so that means just by, through our own experience, we haven't done like a randomized control experimental study, but just through our own experience, we found that having sustained instruction in one program for a significant period of time, meaning like about 6 to 8 weeks. So for example, if a student's going to be getting at our center at Tufts, we used a lot of RAVO, obviously, because we created RAVO, and we paired it with Wilson. So a student would get, like a 6-week dosage of Wilson, and we would end at like a natural stopping point in the curriculum. So Wilson is arranged in units, or what they call steps. So we would end at a step, and then we would shift into RAVO, and we would go through the RAVO units for about 6 to 8 weeks. And we found, and you'll probably talk a little bit about this when you talk about executive functioning, that having the same routine for students every day. So many of these lessons are structured so that it's the same type of routine. You do the activities in the same sequence, is so beneficial for students with dyslexia, because it just takes all of the like confusion and concerns about like, what should I be doing? How should I be doing it off the table? And it allows them to really hone in on the content.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say anything about the importance
No,
of routines.
I could happily go down the rabbit hole of executive function and how to support that that need as well. But I want to return back to naming speed. I'm finding an incredibly positive trend in districts where educators are really honoring that piece of the challenge at the word and the phrase and the sentence level instead of just jumping to the passage level and creating this really nice bridge to passage level fluency by backing up and recognizing the essential how essential it is to really help kids get fluent at smaller chunks of reading before they
Yeah,
can generalize that skill.
yeah,
Uh, and that is such a great shift. And
yeah.
also not too quickly saying, okay, the accuracy of my child has improved. It looks like it's starting to get into the average range. Is our job done? And quickly saying, no, it's not done because they aren't generalizing that accuracy of decoding at a level of speed that then opens up the ability to think about what we've read, which is the whole purpose of reading in the first place, right?
Totally, exactly. Yeah. And I think you're right. Like fluency is not a natural byproduct of reading for all individuals. And I think the key here is really if you are requesting an evaluation, if you're in the process of requesting an evaluation, or you're an educator and you're putting together a battery of assessments for students, one of the key assessments to include is a RAN task. It's very, very quick, but it does give you a very foundational understanding of where the student falls in terms of their risk for a naming speed a weakness. So again, for the phonological subtype, instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics with application to passages, for the naming speed subtype, strategic instruction with fluency, and for the double deficit, we're looking at both. And one thing that I wanted to really point out here too is something that I noticed that is an area where we're always trying to find time to expand is how many opportunities does the student have to read connected text? How many opportunities does the student have to apply what they're learning to a sentence, a story, a book, not just from the curriculum that they're learning from, but even more broadly? How are we supporting generalization? So I do very quickly just want to go over a couple of other pieces. So if your school is screening for the risk of dyslexia, that means that they are trying to identify who is at risk, how significant the risk is, and which skill areas need support. So screening is a use of valid, reliable tools to basically identify who might be at risk for later reading difficulties. Screening is not a direct path to special education. It's part of the general education process. It doesn't have a pass fail score. It's indicating risk. So if the child continued without any instruction, if they have a high level of risk, they are unlikely then to achieve the end of year benchmark. And so the screening is meant to raise the awareness of the school to the needs of students who are at a higher risk of reading challenges and ensure that they begin to put into practice instructional tools that will be effective as early as possible. There are screening guidelines legally in place in Massachusetts right now. So, and you might already know about this if you have a student in public school, that all students K-3 are now legally mandated to be screened by a school twice a year. So that's twice a year. And families, you should be notified if your student's result indicates that they are at significant risk for a reading challenge. And so then you can have a conversation with your education team about how they will be supporting your child at school. And there are a couple different assessments. So schools have been told to use one of the either approved or partially approved screening tools. And they're listed here by the Department of Education. So if your child is identified as being at risk, there is a whole series of activities that should be happening at your school. Again, this graphic is in the dyslexia guidelines. So using the dyslexia guidelines as a conversation tool with your educational team, I hope is helpful. Saying, tell me, what is the beginning of the year benchmark? You know, what is the instruction looking like? Tell me about the progress monitoring that's happening. When are you going to meet again to conduct the mid-year benchmark? So having this kind of sequence in place helps you structure the nature of your conversations and also kind of plan over time. I imagine my child's going to be getting 8 to 10 weeks of intervention because they've been identified as at risk. I would like to check in with my teachers in 8 to 10 weeks to see how things are going. Before we get into structured literacy, do we want to do questions or we want to go through this? What do you
You
think?
know, totally up to you. So we do have a number of questions that are topical to some of the bullet points that you just brought up.
Okay.
So maybe we do a couple questions now,
Okay.
give you a chance to kind of catch your breath related to, going through your slide deck.
Yeah.
So the first, I'm gonna go these in backwards order. My son, the question says, my son is double deficit subtype, and he's had OJ instruction for about 2.5 years now. I feel that he may need some other type of instruction added, but I'm not sure about what that would be or how about going, getting some changes. What would you recommend?
Yeah. So I think that that's where, when we think if it's a double deficit, so the Orkin-Gillingham instruction is going to likely target the phonological subtype piece, but for the rapid naming, you might need some more strategic instruction and fluency. So kind of depending on his age and his progression, you could look at you could look into programs like Ravo, you could look into programs like Language Exclamation Point Live. Are there fluency programs that you use, Adam, that you?
So we've used the ones that you've mentioned, except we don't use Ravo, but we
Okay.
do great. Do you say Great Leaps? Was that one of the
Yeah,
ones?
Great Leaps
Yeah.
can be helpful. Yeah.
But we also really tried to leverage some of our own design stuff around repeated readings in a really strategic way,
Yeah.
um, and really helping students first focus their attention on the purpose of the task and then engaging in that task. And that attention activation we're finding is so essential. And I
Hmm.
think you were starting to talk a little bit about that when you said, you know, you want the student to be engaged with an instructional practice for a certain length of time so that it's predictable. It's normed, they're used to doing it. And I totally agree with that. But it also tees up our next question, which was to confirm, you're saying alternating between programs to address double deficit is effective.
Yes.
Can you go back and circle back on that, please?
Yeah. So what I was saying was that, there are lots of students who have a double deficit profile. So when you mean circle back, do you mean going right back to the,
Yeah,
to the
well, I
circling back
think
like
that,
this? Okay.
well, I
Yeah.
think the question really speaks to, and you do want to complement your OG or your Wilson with
Yeah.
another instructional practice, remedial practice that's
Yeah.
going to hit that automaticity or that fluency piece.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I
Yeah,
think
exactly.
the
Yeah.
chart that you said is another really great place to look to begin the conversation with schools about what should the complementary intervention be, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the intervention itself might vary. I think, one thing we can do, and this is something that I'm always trying to like, walk this fine line on, and you probably are too, is you want to deliver a program with fidelity, and you want to, keep to the elements of the program that make it successful. But at the same time, you want the program to meet the needs of the student sitting in front of you. So rather than teaching the program, you want to teach the student. And so at times I will take strategies from a fluency program like Ravo, and I will layer them onto like Wilson content. So for example, Ravo focuses heavily on rhyme pattern work, reading words by rhyme pattern, because that is a very effective tool for both mapping, for orthographic mapping, and also for just increasing automaticity of word reading rather than tapping out each sound, being able to see a larger unit of a word like a rhyme pattern and be able to recognize that just, helps build the automaticity of reading. So I can take that strategy and within a Wilson lesson, layer that strategy into the Wilson lesson. And so I think there's the idea first of like, how do we make sure that we're using the best instructional or pedagogical strategies for a student's profile, regardless of the program that we're using? And then the other question was like, in terms of the sequence that you're using the programs in, we, have consulted with a lot of schools that were trying to either teach two curricula in one lesson. For example, they have a 45-minute lesson. They're trying to do 30 minutes of one and 15 minutes of the other. Or over the course of the week, they're doing 3 days of one program and 2 days of another if they have, 5 days of service delivery. And that for most of the students is too disjointed. It's just too much kind of switching back and forth between strategies and expectations. And so we found anecdotally that students performed better when they had these sort of blocks of instruction rather than like kind of that, ongoing up and down of like one program, the other program, one program, the other program. Yeah.
So a number of people are asking a very similar question, and it's a question that comes up a lot when I'm in districts helping educators. And it's that the student's been involved in a Wilson or an OG for a fairly good length of time and is
Okay.
really not responding well to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you begin to answer that question where you need to look closely at how the minutes are being used. And are we not, what is the dosage in reality
Yeah.
versus what is on paper? But another piece keeps popping, Melissa, and I just want your thoughts on this. Sometimes students are given a Wilson or OG lesson or methodology, and yet the underlining phonological subtype is so severe that they would have been better suited for something like lips
Mm-hmm.
and to prepare them to be available to make really effective progress using a Wilson or an OG.
Yeah.
And I was fearful of throwing that palm out there tonight because
Yeah.
at the same time, I don't want people to approach the school and say, oh, my friend's child's responding really well to this instructional methodology. I think we should try that with my child.
Yeah.
It's much more important for us to remind everybody we need to look at what's going on with the individual student as we
Yeah.
make decisions about the best course of action.
I agree. Yeah, I agree, Adam. I think that you're right. I think that that's where something like a graphic organizer can help because it's just laying out all of the scores in a way that allows you to clearly see kind of how the pieces fit together. There are lots of students for whom a program is not appropriate. And it's often because something about their profile is a mismatch for the program. So, for example, programs like Orkin, Gillingham, and Wilson are very linguistic. They're teaching the rules of language and they're very rules based. And for some children, it works beautifully and they get the rule, they hang on to it and they apply it. For other students, the rules, like if the vowel is short and it's closed in by a consonant, then it's a closed syllable, they just kind of hang in the ether and the students can't really incorporate them into their practices, and so they respond better to an instruction that tends to be more like language friendly, something maybe like brings the letters to life, or something that's more multisensory, like as you said, ellipse, and helps with the articulatory components of sounds, or maybe like a seeing stars where you're sequencing, you're doing a lot of the sequencing work, or you're using something that's just a little bit less meta about the rules and
Yeah,
is more just direct instruction.
yeah.
So I think that really, as you said, exploring like what do we think is the mismatch here and being open to, having a conversation and a dialogue with the team about what other resources are available.
I think that's the most critical part and answers a lot of the questions that are coming in really about the apparent mismatch between an approach and the way the student's responding. And I just want to remind everybody, it's all the instruction is happening in the context of a child who has dyslexia. And
Mhm.
we would expect that the change in skill is going to be slow. And
Mhm.
that's okay. So we celebrate those wins, but understand it can be a long road before these skills become automatic.
Yeah. Yeah. Good
So,
reminder.
so those are a good couple questions, but I'm gonna let
Yeah.
you jump. I'm being
Well, this
mindful.
is really more about just kind of some critical ideas about instruction, and I'm happy to share these in the slides and people can review them. But
Yeah,
there might be, participants who are here who are thinking more about their older child with dyslexia.
sure.
So
Yeah.
would you want to talk a little bit about some of the different considerations for older students, maybe in terms of like executive functioning, if you are have dyslexia or writing?
Yeah. So let's start with the EF part and to kind of introduce this shift to the older student and what's happening in districts is that really at a granular level, my day is driving to a school district, meeting with a group of educators, sometimes under the umbrella of special education, and helping them design and implement instruction to meet and support the needs of students with dyslexia in the public school setting, so that that child does not need to go to a school like Landmark School. And we certainly provide the support around the decoding, the fluency, and the comprehension for reading. But that's only part of the picture. We also really need to supply some really explicit support around written expression. So, what is a sentence? And how do we move a child from just gleaning what a sentence is through exposure to text to understand the components, the syntactical components that make up a sentence, and then how to gain control of that and manipulate that knowledge in order to communicate what they have in their brain that they want to say. That's the biggest frustration, I think, for a child with dyslexia is that they are often very bright and they want to express some really interesting ideas, but the speed at which they can't get it out just frustrates them. And then you enter in this cycle of failure that is incredibly defeatist. So
Yeah.
we really need to break that.
So there's a question about like, what about homework for a student with dyslexia? What are your opinions? Like, how much homework should a child be receiving? How do you know the homework's appropriate?
Yeah. I love to default and recommend and engage in conversations with educators around really good homework decisions for students in our language-based models. And that I pick up on the landmark approach, which is never teach new content. So
Mm-hmm.
there was this idea of a flipped classroom that happened a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
where technology allowed teachers to say to a child, your homework tonight is to preview
Yeah.
some really complicated, complex, for you, very new concepts without any teacher support
Mm-hmm.
while you're in your bedroom or at the dining room table. And then we're going to practice that knowledge tomorrow. That flipped classroom, I think, was not a good
Yeah.
experiment.
No.
But to go back to the question, so I think a better approach for homework is let's use the homework time to practice any concepts that
Mm-hmm.
were taught explicitly in school that day.
Yeah.
And so we provide that additional minutes and practice to consolidate that knowledge base so that we're working to a level of fluency.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful district I've worked with in the past that for their lower elementary grades adopted the 3 Rs. So it was 15 minutes of rest for homework, and this was early elementary,
Yeah.
15 minutes of recreation,
Mm-hmm.
and 15 minutes of reading,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that looked like. So they were building in this practice of the child understanding, I got to get outside and run around for 15 minutes,
Yeah.
right? But to get back to the writing piece for the older grades, we also really tried to look at that linguistic instruction connected to whatever the curricula that is happening in the general ed setting. Because at some point, our students are going to intersect, even if they're in small group, with the general ed setting. And it's really helpful if the school district has embraced something like framing your thoughts, to use a version or an adaptation of framing your thoughts with some of the explicit written expression instruction we're doing, so
Mm-hmm.
that it doesn't feel like such a massive jump when they go back into the general ed setting for English language arts.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of the executive function wraparound piece, what I'm really finding is that we create some really explicit and expected instructional practices in our classrooms to meet the needs of the kids with dyslexia. Um, but we have general educators who are walking by that classroom and recognizing the power of those instructional practices and saying, well, maybe I should be using those in my general ed
Yeah.
setting as well. And more, my work is really going beyond the small group classrooms into the intersection with general educators who are embracing what is an equity issue for a child with dyslexia, but in reality is just good teaching
Yeah.
for every neurotypical or other disability category that happens to be sitting in those other classrooms.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think that, I had the privilege of being able to see a district where your team at Landmark had consulted on a language-based program where the students were receiving their math and language skills, in a specialized classroom, but they were in the general education classrooms for social studies and science, and the whole team of educators worked really well together, and they all adopted the same practices in terms of supporting the students in keeping track of their materials, identifying the learning objective, starting each lesson with a visual, which is a very, UDL or universal design for learning, like giving everybody an access point to
Yep.
start, thinking about content and activating background knowledge. Like they all had these same practices. They all modified notes for the students, and they just had, it was very consistent across the team. And that team, I think, had been working together for a while. So I think we can't expect the moon. It
Right.
doesn't happen overnight. But I think starting to have these conversations about how can teams of educators work together, regardless of their role, whether they're a special educator or a general educator, to, as you said, align their practices and to really put like the teach in teacher to ensure that that explicit instruction is happening kind of as a default across settings.
I think that tees up a really good summative statement as we approach the 8 o'clock hour. The idea that you need to approach this as a team. So as we think about homework and as we think about our initial conversations with the teaching team or administrators, I would encourage people going in there in a collaborative way and say, look, we have a child who's struggling. Let's rally together in a way that's going to allow us to support each other in helping that child be successful.
Yeah, great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Melissa, thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining me tonight. I am always shocked at how fast an hour
The hour
webinar
goes
goes
quickly.
by, especially
And
on
you
a
have a
topic.
great speaker next time too. That's exciting.
We do. So our next Landmark Learns is going to be April 24th. Same time, it'll be 7, 8 o'clock. And we have Gabby Schlickman, who is an incredible researcher that I've worked with for a number of years, who's doing some really interesting projects on both of our Landmark campuses right now.
Cool.
So I encourage everybody to look forward to Gabby's presentation on April 24th around positive self-concepts. But again, Melissa, I cannot thank you enough for joining me tonight.
Yeah, thank you,
Great.
Adam. Thanks everyone out there for spending an hour with us this evening.
Yep.
All right. Take care.